The first thing people noticed was the silence. Not the comfortable kind you find in expensive places, but the kind that creeps in when something feels off. The restaurant was one of those places most people only saw online: polished marble floors, soft golden lighting, waiters moving like clockwork, and guests who spoke quietly but confidently, as if the room itself belonged to them. This wasn't just a place to eat, it was a place to be seen. Status mattered here. Reputation mattered even more. That was why almost no one paid attention when a simple-looking man walked in. No entourage, no designer labels screaming for attention, no confidence that demanded the room to notice him. He looked calm, ordinary, almost out of place. For a brief moment, he paused near the entrance, taking in the atmosphere, not impressed, not intimidated, just observant. To anyone watching casually, he seemed like someone who had wandered into the wrong world. But then the mood shifted. Across the room sat a man everyone recognized immediately. A UFC champion, loud, confident, surrounded by people who laughed a little too hard at his jokes. His presence filled the space effortlessly. He was used to being watched, admired, respected, sometimes feared, and he noticed the quiet man instantly. At first, it was just a look. A slow, dismissive scan from head to toe. The kind of look that decides your worth in seconds. Then a smirk appeared, followed by a laugh that carried farther than it should have. The champion leaned back in his chair and said something, just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Heads began to turn. The quiet man kept walking unfazed as if he hadn't heard a thing. That only seemed to amuse the champion more. His voice grew louder, sharper, more deliberate. This time, the words were unmistakable. A public challenge, a mocking remark, a question meant to humiliate, not to be answered. The laughter around the table grew. A few guests joined in, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one intervened. No one wanted to be involved. This was how places like this worked. Power spoke, and everyone else listened. The quiet man stopped. Slowly, he turned to face the champion. There was no anger on his face, no embarrassment, no attempt to defend himself. His expression didn't change at all. He simply looked at the man who had just tried to turn him into a joke. And then, nothing happened. No argument, no comeback, no explanation. He said nothing. That silence did something strange to the room. What should have been an easy moment, one man dominating another, suddenly felt unfinished, incomplete. The champion expected a reaction. Everyone did. Instead, they got calm. The quiet man held the champion's gaze for a second longer than expected, then turned away as if the moment no longer deserved his attention. He moved toward a table, his posture relaxed, his pace unhurried. That was when the tension truly began. Because confidence that doesn't need to speak is unsettling, and silence, when used deliberately, can feel heavier than words. Some guests felt a sudden chill of secondhand embarrassment. Others frowned, sensing that they might be laughing at the wrong person. The champion's smile faded slightly, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough to matter. What no one in that room understood yet was this. The man they had just dismissed didn't need to prove himself. He didn't need approval, and he certainly didn't need to raise his voice. Because without anyone realizing it, the balance of power had already started to shift. And in just a short time, the name Steven Seagal would change everything they thought they understood about strength, respect, and who truly belonged in that room. The restaurant had a reputation long before it had regulars. It wasn't just expensive, it was selective. The kind of place where reservations were whispered about, where tables were booked weeks in advance, and where the unspoken rule was clear: not everyone belonged. The moment you stepped inside, you felt it. The lighting was warm but controlled, designed to flatter faces and hide imperfections. The air carried the subtle scent of polished wood, fine wine, and money that didn't need to announce itself. This was a room built on hierarchy. Men in tailored suits spoke in low, assured tones. Women wore elegance like armor, every detail intentional. Watches flashed briefly under cuffed sleeves. Lauder was measured. Even joy had discipline here. People didn't come just to eat. They came to confirm who they were and where they stood. The staff mirrored that energy perfectly. Every waiter moved with precision, posture straight, expressions neutral but alert. They were trained to read people instantly, who deserved extra attention, who needed to be impressed, and who could be ignored without consequence. Years of experience had taught them that appearances usually told the full story. Usually, the quiet man, now seated alone at a modest table, stood out for all the wrong reasons. Not because he was loud or disruptive, but because he didn't match the visual language of the room. His clothes were simple, clean but unremarkable. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed importance. He looked comfortable, though. Not in awe, not self-conscious, just present. Across the room, the UFC champion was very much in his element. This was familiar territory for him: attention, recognition, power. He was used to rooms bending slightly around his presence. Conversations paused when he spoke. Heads turned when he laughed. His confidence wasn't forced, it was practiced, reinforced by years of admiration and victory. In places like this, fame acted like a currency. The people around him leaned in, eager to be close to it. Some were friends. Others were admirers pretending to be equals. Their body language said everything. Shoulders angled toward him, eyes locked on his reactions, laughter timed perfectly. He belonged here. Everyone could see that. The quiet man did not, or so it seemed. Whispers began. Subtle at first. A glance here. A raised eyebrow there. The kind of silent commentary that never quite forms into words but spreads anyway. Someone wondered aloud how he got a table. Another guest smirked and shook his head as if the answer was obvious. The staff noticed too. A waiter paused longer than necessary while checking the seating chart. Another exchanged a quick look with a colleague. There was confusion, maybe even irritation. This restaurant prided itself on maintaining a certain image, and the quiet man disrupted it simply by existing. Still, no one approached him yet. There was a tension in the air now, not dramatic, not explosive, but sharp enough to be felt. It was the tension that comes from imbalance, from something not aligning the way it should. The kind that makes people uncomfortable without knowing why. The quiet man sat calmly, hands resting on the table, eyes moving slowly around the room. He wasn't scanning for approval or searching for recognition. He observed the details, the way people held themselves, the way power moved invisibly from one table to another, the way confidence shifted when someone with a louder presence spoke. He had seen rooms like this before. Not just restaurants, but boardrooms, training halls, private gatherings where status was weaponized and ego ran unchecked. Places where people mistook volume for authority and appearance for substance. Across the room, the UFC champion felt the attention begin to drift. Not entirely, just enough for him to notice. His earlier remarks had sparked laughter, but now the energy had changed. Some guests were no longer amused. Others looked away, suddenly aware that they might have joined in too easily. That awareness irritated him. In his world, challenges were met with responses, pushback, resistance. Silence was unexpected, and worse, it was boring. The quiet man's refusal to react denied him the satisfaction of dominance, and denial to someone fueled by ego feels like disrespect. The restaurant continued operating around them. Plates were served, glasses were refilled. Soft music played in the background. On the surface, everything was normal. But beneath that polished routine, something was building. A few guests began to sense it. There was a subtle shift in how the staff moved now, less confident, more cautious. A manager lingered near the edge of the dining room watching, as if waiting for something he couldn't quite name. Conversations dropped in volume, not intentionally, but instinctively. The quiet man hadn't said a word, yet his presence was changing the room. This was the dangerous part, the moment before realization. When people still believed they were in control, unaware that their assumptions were already collapsing. When arrogance felt safe because consequences hadn't arrived yet. In places ruled by status, humility is often mistaken for weakness, and that mistake was about to cost someone dearly. The balance between power and perception had begun to tilt, and no amount of reputation or physical dominance would be able to stop what was coming next. Because when a room built on ego encounters someone who doesn't need it, the illusion doesn't just crack, it shatters. Have you ever seen a moment where confidence stayed quiet while arrogance stayed loud? Comment below what you noticed first, the room, the champion, or the silence. The waiter had been watching from a distance. He had noticed the quiet man the moment he sat down, not because he caused trouble, but because he didn't fit. Years of working in places like this had trained the waiter to judge quickly. Clothes, posture, confidence. Those things usually told him everything he needed to know. And this man, in his eyes, told the wrong story. The waiter adjusted his jacket and took a slow breath before approaching the table. His expression was polite on the surface, but there was an edge beneath it, an impatience sharpened by pride. He stopped just short of the table, glanced down briefly, then looked away as if already annoyed by the interaction. "Are you aware," the waiter said, his voice carrying farther than necessary, "that this restaurant has a dress code?" A few heads turned. The quiet man looked up calmly, no surprise, no defensiveness, just attention. He replied evenly. The waiter raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Because," he continued, gesturing vaguely around the room, "this isn't exactly a casual place." The implication was clear. The man didn't argue, he didn't explain. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging information he already understood. That seemed to irritate the waiter even more. "Normally," the waiter said, his tone shifting from professional to personal, We reserve tables like this for guests who belong here." The pause before the last words was intentional. Laughter rippled from a nearby table. Not loud, just enough to encourage him. The waiter glanced toward the sound, emboldened, then looked back at the man. "I'm surprised you were even seated," he added. There must have been some kind of mistake. The room grew quieter. Some guests leaned back in their chairs, sensing the shift from awkward to uncomfortable. Others watched openly now, curiosity replacing casual indifference. Moments like this had a way of pulling attention whether people wanted it or not. The quiet man met the waiter's gaze. His face remained relaxed, unreadable. "There's no mistake," he said calmly. That response, measured, confident, caught the waiter off guard for half a second. But instead of backing off, he doubled down. "Well," he said, letting out a short laugh, "we do have to maintain a certain standard. And standards exist for a reason." He looked around the room again, as if seeking agreement from the audience he had unintentionally gathered. A few guests nodded. Others looked away. The UFC champion noticed too. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, a grin forming as he listened. This was entertainment now, a familiar pattern, someone being reminded of their place. He added a comment of his own, something dismissive, something sharp, loud enough to be heard. The waiter smiled. Encouraged by the champion's presence, he felt untouchable. This wasn't just about enforcing rules anymore. It was about control. About showing authority in front of the right people. "I'll need to ask you to either move to a different section," the waiter said, his voice firm, "or leave altogether." The words landed heavily. The quiet man didn't flinch. He glanced around the room slowly, taking in the faces watching him now, the curious, the amused, the uncomfortable. Then he looked back at the waiter. "Is that necessary?" he asked, still calm. That question, simple as it was, felt like a challenge. The waiter straightened. "Absolutely," he replied. "This isn't a place for just anyone to walk in off the street." The insult was no longer subtle. A hush settled over the room. Even the background music seemed quieter now. Plates paused midair. Conversation stopped completely. The line had been crossed and everyone knew it. The quiet man sat still, hands resting on the table. His posture didn't change. His expression didn't harden. If anything, he seemed more composed than before. That composure confused the waiter. Most people reacted by now: anger, embarrassment, pleading. Something. But this man offered none of it. No apology, no explanation, no resistance. Silence. The UFC champion scoffed. "Wes, tonight's not your night," he said casually, swirling the drink in his glass. A few people laughed again, though this time it sounded forced. The waiter waited, expecting compliance, or at least visible discomfort. When neither came, irritation crept into his voice. "I don't want to make this difficult," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "But if you can't afford the experience, it's better to be honest." That did it. The insult hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about worth. Some guests shifted in their seats, suddenly embarrassed to be witnesses. Others watched closely, sensing that this moment mattered more than it should have. The quiet man finally moved. Slowly, deliberately. He placed his hands flat on the table and stood up, not abruptly, not defensively, just enough to meet the waiter at eye level. For a split second, the waiter felt something unexpected: pressure. Not physical, not threatening, just a presence that felt solid. Unmoving, the quiet man spoke softly. "You've said what you needed to say. That was all." No raised voice, no insult returned, no attempt to dominate. And yet, the effect was immediate. The waiter hesitated, unsure why. The champion's smile faded slightly. The room held its breath. Because for the first time since the insult began, it was no longer clear who was actually in control. And everyone could feel it. The room didn't erupt. It didn't calm down either. It hovered in between, caught in a fragile stillness that felt heavier than noise. The quiet man remained standing, his posture relaxed, shoulders loose, hands resting calmly at his sides. There was no stiffness in him, no sign of adrenaline or offense. If anything, he looked as though he had stepped out of the moment rather than into it. That alone unsettled everyone watching. People were used to confrontation following humiliation. Raised voices, sharp words, escalation. But this man offered none of it. He didn't lean forward aggressively. He didn't step back submissively. He simply stood there, balanced and unbothered, as if the waiter's words had passed through him without landing. The waiter shifted his weight. Up close, something felt different now. The man's calm wasn't passive, it was deliberate, measured. The kind of stillness that suggested choice, not hesitation. For reasons he couldn't explain, the waiter suddenly felt the urge to fill the silence. "I'm just doing my job," he said, louder than necessary. The quiet man nodded once, slowly. Not in agreement, in acknowledgement. "I understand," he replied. 2 words, no edge, no challenge. And yet, The effect rippled outward. The UFC champion frowned, sensing the change before he could explain it. The entertainment he had expected was slipping away. This wasn't dominance anymore. This was something else, something he didn't control. The quiet man didn't look at him. Didn't look at the surrounding guests either. He kept his attention on the waiter, his gaze steady but not confrontational. It was the look of someone listening fully, not waiting to speak. That unnerved the waiter more than anger ever could. Like I said, the waiter continued, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. This place has standards. Silence followed. The quiet man didn't respond immediately. He didn't rush to defend himself or justify his presence. Instead, he let the words sit where they were, unanswered, unchallenged. The pause stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Around the room, people felt it. A woman at a nearby table lowered her fork slowly. A man near the bar crossed his arms, suddenly uncertain about whose side he was on. Even the background music felt intrusive now, as if it didn't belong in the moment. The quiet man finally spoke. "Standards are important," he said calmly. The waiter straightened, encouraged. "Exactly. But," the man continued, his tone unchanged, "they reveal more about the people enforcing them than the people facing them." The words were soft, respectful, and devastating. No accusation, no insult, just truth. The waiter opened his mouth, then closed it again. He hadn't expected that. The sentence didn't attack him directly, yet it stripped away his authority in front of everyone watching. The UFC champion leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. Something about this exchange bothered him deeply. He was used to winning confrontations through presence alone, through reputation, through intimidation. But this man wasn't playing that game. The quiet man didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand respect. He didn't even ask for it. He simply stood unmoved, letting his composure do the work. Time stretched. 10 seconds passed, then 20. In that silence, the balance of power shifted again, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The waiter felt exposed. His earlier sarcasm now seemed reckless, petty. He became acutely aware of the number of eyes on him, the way the room's attention had turned. He wasn't in control anymore. The quiet man sat back down slowly, signaling that the exchange, at least for him, was over. He adjusted his chair slightly, picked up the menu, and looked at it as if nothing unusual had happened. That was the moment the room truly changed. Because dominance usually demands attention. But this man withdrew it. The UFC champion scoffed quietly, trying to reclaim the mood with a dismissive laugh. "Unbelievable," he muttered. But his voice lacked conviction now. A few minutes earlier, people would have laughed along. This time no one did. The silence had taught them something. The waiter stood frozen for a moment longer, unsure of his next move. He had expected defiance or submission. He got neither. And without either, his authority had nowhere to go. Finally, he stepped back, murmuring something about checking with the manager. It sounded procedural, but everyone knew it was retreat. As he walked away, whispers followed, not mocking this time, but questioning. "Who is he? Did you notice how calm he was? That wasn't normal." The quiet man remained seated, his attention back on the table, his breathing slow and steady. He hadn't won anything yet. No one had apologized. No truth had been revealed. But the most important thing had already happened. He had taken control without force. Without ego, without saying more than necessary. In a room built on status, he had removed himself from the hierarchy entirely, and in doing so, stood above it. And though no one knew his name yet, they all felt it. Something irreversible had begun. The waiter's footsteps faded toward the back, but the tension he left behind stayed. It settled into the room slowly, like a fog no one could see yet everyone could feel. Conversations didn't resume the way they normally would. Plates arrived late. Glasses sat untouched. People spoke again, but in quieter voices, as if volume itself had suddenly become inappropriate. The quiet man remained seated. He hadn't shifted nervously, hadn't looked around to see who was watching. He didn't need to. Awareness wasn't something he chased, it found him anyway. The room had begun to orbit around his stillness, and everyone sensed it, even if they couldn't explain why. At a nearby table, a couple leaned toward each other. That was strange. The woman whispered. Her partner nodded. He didn't react at all. Across the room, two men in suits exchanged looks. One of them frowned, tapping his fingers lightly against the table, replaying the moment in his head. He had seen arrogance before. He had also seen confidence. What he had just witnessed didn't fit either category cleanly. The UFC champion noticed the shift too. He had expected applause, laughter, validation. Instead, the energy had drained away from him and pooled somewhere else, quietly, inexplicably. His earlier grin felt out of place now, stretched thin. He took a sip of his drink, hoping to ground himself, but even that felt hollow. He glanced at the quiet man again. There was no triumph on his face, no satisfaction, no smugness. Just calm focus, as if the entire exchange had already passed and no longer mattered. That bothered the champion more than any insult could have. Because being ignored is worse than being challenged. A staff member passed by the quiet man's table, hesitated, then continued walking. Another slowed down, clearly debating whether to say something, before thinking better of it. The certainty the staff had moved with earlier was gone. In its place was caution. Whispers traveled faster now. Did you hear what he said back? No, but did you see how the waiter reacted? That wasn't fear, but it wasn't confidence either. Someone closer to the bar leaned over and murmured, "People like that don't explain themselves." That comment landed quietly, but it spread. The manager, standing near the edge of the dining room, had stopped pretending not to watch. He wasn't panicked, not yet. But his instincts were firing. He had learned long ago to trust them, especially in a room like this. Problems here didn't announce themselves loudly. They arrived disguised as misunderstandings. And misunderstandings could be costly. The UFC champion shifted in his seat, irritation creeping in. He felt the room slipping from his grasp, and he didn't like it. He leaned toward one of his companions and said something under his breath, trying to reclaim the moment. The response he got was muted. Distracted. Their attention was elsewhere now. The quiet man picked up his glass and took a slow sip of water. The small, deliberate motion drew more eyes than it should have. It was as if people were studying him for clues, searching for signs they had missed earlier. One guest narrowed his eyes, suddenly thoughtful. "I've seen that posture before," he whispered to his table. "That's not someone trying to prove anything." A woman nearby nodded slowly. "That's someone who doesn't have to." The tension tightened. Time stretched unnaturally, as if the room itself was waiting. Waiting for confirmation. Waiting for someone to explain what they were sensing but couldn't name. The waiter hadn't returned yet. That absence spoke volumes. Normally, authority reasserted itself quickly in places like this. Rules were enforced, guests complied, the flow resumed. But now the delay felt intentional, as though something larger was being weighed behind closed doors. The UFC champion tapped his fingers against the table, louder than necessary. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But even he didn't sound convinced anymore. His confidence, once effortless, now felt performative. The quiet man remained untouched by it all. He didn't watch the door, didn't check the time, didn't fidget. He sat as though he had nowhere else to be, and nothing to prove if he stayed. That composure began to unsettle people in a deeper way. A guest near the entrance leaned back and whispered, "You know what scares me?" Another asked, "What?" "When someone doesn't rush to defend themselves." That sentence lingered. Because everyone in that room had defended themselves at some point, through words, through status, through appearances. The quiet man had done none of that. And yet, the room now felt like it belonged to him more than anyone else. The manager took a step forward, then stopped. He glanced toward the back again, then at the quiet man's table. Something about the situation felt familiar, uncomfortably so. Like the early moments before a realization that changes everything. He straightened his jacket. Around the room, people sensed it too. This wasn't over. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a pause before impact. And as the seconds passed, one truth became harder to ignore. Whoever that man was, he was not ordinary. And the mistake that had just been made was far bigger than anyone wanted to admit. At this point, what would you be thinking if you were in that room? Confusion, curiosity, or concern? Tell us which feeling hit you first. The manager finally moved. At first, it was subtle, a straightening of his jacket, a measured breath, a look toward the back hallway that suggested a decision had just been made. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. But something in his expression had changed from watchful to certain. The room noticed. People felt it before they understood it. Conversation stopped again. Chairs creaked softly as guests adjusted their posture, instinctively preparing for whatever came next. Even the UFC champion leaned forward slightly, sensing that the moment was no longer his to control. The manager walked with purpose now, each step steady, deliberate. He didn't approach the waiter's station. He didn't glance at the champion's table. His focus was locked on one place and one place only, the quiet man's table. As the manager crossed the room, a path seemed to open without anyone consciously making it. Staff stepped aside. Guests leaned back. It was as if the room itself recognized the importance of what was about to happen. The quiet man looked up, not startled, not defensive, just attentive. The manager stopped a respectful distance from the table. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he nodded slightly sincerely, a gesture that carried more weight than words. "Good evening, sir," he said. His tone was different from anything heard so far that night. Gone was the polished neutrality reserved for customers. This was respect unmistakable, unforced. The UFC champion frowned. Something wasn't right. The manager continued, his voice calm but firm. "I apologize for the interruption." The quiet man inclined his head politely. "Of course." The manager hesitated for half a second longer, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he spoke again, just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Sir Steven Seagal." The effect was immediate. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was absolute. The name landed like a switch being flipped. A collective inhale swept through the room. Faces changed in real time, smirks disappearing, eyes widening, jaws tightening. Some guests froze. Others turned sharply, staring openly now, no longer pretending not to watch. The UFC champion went still. The glass in his hand paused midair. Steven Seagal, the quiet man, calm, unbothered, unreactive, was suddenly no longer anonymous. The assumptions that had filled the room moments earlier collapsed all at once, replaced by recognition and disbelief. The waiter, who had returned just in time to hear the name, felt his stomach drop. His confidence evaporated instantly. He stood there, rigid, replaying every word he had said, every look he had given, every moment of condescension he could no longer undo. His face drained of color as the weight of the realization settled in. The manager turned slightly toward him, not angrily, not accusingly, but the disappointment was unmistakable. "Please step back," the manager said quietly. The waiter obeyed without hesitation. Around the room, whispers erupted, not mocking now, but stunned. "That's him. No way. I didn't recognize him." He didn't say a word. The UFC champion's earlier swagger felt distant now, like a memory from another lifetime. He had built his identity on strength, reputation, and public dominance. But in that moment, all of it felt fragile. He had challenged the wrong man. Not physically, not loudly, but fundamentally. Steven Seagal remained seated. He hadn't corrected anyone, hadn't acknowledged the reveal with pride or irritation. If anything, he looked mildly inconvenienced, less by the insult, more by the attention it now brought. The manager leaned in slightly. "I want to personally apologize for what occurred," he said. "It does not reflect our standards." Steven looked at him calmly. "I understand," he replied. "Mistakes happen." The simplicity of the response stunned people even more. No outrage, no demand for punishment, no public shaming. The manager nodded again, relieved but still visibly shaken. "We'll handle this immediately," he said. Steven lifted a hand gently. "Please," he said, his voice steady. "There's no need for a scene." That restraint, after everything, sent another ripple through the room. The UFC champion finally stood up. Not confidently this time. Carefully. "I didn't know," he said, his voice lower than before. "If I had..." Steven turned his head slightly, acknowledging him for the first time since the insult began. His expression was neutral, not cold, not forgiving, just present. "Knowing my name wouldn't have changed what you said," Steven replied calmly. The sentence wasn't loud, it wasn't sharp, but it cut deeper than any insult. Silence followed, because everyone understood the truth in it. The manager cleared his throat softly. "Sir, would you like us to..." Steven shook his head once. "No," he said. "Let it stand." He rose slowly from his chair, not in anger, not in triumph, just with quiet certainty. The room watched him now with a different kind of attention, one that came not from fame alone, but from understanding. The illusion of power had been exposed, and nothing in that room would feel the same again. The room didn't rush back to normal after Steven Seagal stood up. If anything, it slowed down even more. People expected something dramatic next, raised voices, security stepping in, a public reprimand. That was how stories like this usually ended. Someone won loudly, someone lost publicly. Balance was restored through force. But none of that happened. Steven remained standing for a moment, not because he needed attention, but because the moment itself demanded stillness. He looked around the room, not scanning faces, not measuring reactions, just acknowledging the space as it was now. Changed. The manager waited respectfully, unsure whether to speak. The waiter stood off to the side, silent, shoulders tight, replaying every second in his mind. The UFC champion remained standing too, his confidence replaced by something unfamiliar, awareness. Steven finally spoke again, his voice calm, even, and steady enough to carry without effort. "This isn't about a name," he said, "and it's not about status." People leaned in without realizing it. "It's about how easily we decide who deserves respect and who doesn't." No accusation followed, no finger pointed, just a statement left to stand on its own. The manager nodded slowly, absorbing the words. He had managed rooms like this for years, seen power shift in subtle ways, but rarely had he seen it exposed so cleanly. The illusion that control came from authority alone had been stripped away. Steven turned slightly toward the waiter. The waiter swallowed hard, bracing himself. "You did what you thought you were supposed to do," Steven said. But next time, ask yourself why. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't punishment. It was something heavier. The waiter nodded, unable to speak. The lesson had already landed deeper than any reprimand ever could. Steven then looked toward the UFC champion. The man met his gaze, no longer defiant, no longer amused. He didn't look defeated either, just confronted with something he hadn't trained for. Strength, Steven said calmly, is easy to perform when people are watching. The champion shifted uncomfortably. But restraint, Steven continued, is what shows who you really are. The words weren't loud, but they echoed. No one clapped, no one interrupted. This wasn't a speech meant to impress. It was a boundary being drawn quietly, unmistakably. The champion nodded once. I crossed a line, he admitted. Steven acknowledged it with a slight incline of his head, no smile, no satisfaction, just closure. Around the room, people felt something release. The tension that had built for so long didn't explode, it dissolved. Conversations resumed slowly, cautiously, as if people were testing the air before trusting it again. Staff moved with renewed focus, but also with a different awareness now. They had witnessed something rare. Not a victory, not a humiliation, a recalibration. The manager gestured discreetly toward another table, offering Steven a more private seat, a gesture of respect now fully understood. Steven declined politely. This is fine, he said. He returned to his chair, picked up the menu again, and looked at it as if the evening could continue. And somehow it could. The UFC champion sat back down as well, quieter than before. His companions spoke less now, not because they were afraid, but because something had shifted in how they saw him, and perhaps themselves. Status no longer felt permanent. The waiter returned later, posture different, tone softer. He placed a glass of water on Steven's table and paused. Thank you, he said quietly. Steven nodded. You're welcome. That was it. No audience, no performance. Just a moment of growth that didn't need witnesses to be real. As the evening moved forward, the restaurant regained its rhythm, but not its innocence. People would leave that night remembering the food, the atmosphere. But more than that, they would remember how quickly assumptions collapsed. They would remember how silence had overpowered noise, how calm had outweighed ego, how true authority never announced itself. Steven finished his meal, stood once more, and left without ceremony. No phones raised, no requests for photos, just respectful distance. The door closed behind him, and the room exhaled. Because everyone there understood something they hadn't before. Respect isn't earned through reputation, it's revealed through behavior, and those who judge first often learn last. What do you think left the biggest impact, the silence, the reveal, or the lesson at the end? Share your thoughts below. Your feedback helps shape the next story.